Initially, in Mendel's garden, he noticed that all of his plants were either tall or they were short. And what he came to realize was this was because the plants were true breeding. So, true breeding means that you have a tall plant, and on the tall plant, pea plants, they happen to have the male gamete, which is on a stem that kind of extends out of the flower, but they also had the female gamete buried within the flower. So what a true breeding plant would do would be the male gamete, it would kind of come off of the male part, and it would go down into the flower, and it would fertilize the female gamete. So what we ended up getting was tall plants were always producing tall plants 100% of the time. And essentially, this plant, it was a clone almost of this plant, because 100% of the DNA that this plant had, it came from its parent. It only had one parent. Similarly, with short plants, they would, again, just like the tall plants, they would fertilize themselves, which would lead to short plants. So 100% of the time, this is what was happening. Now, what Mendel started to wonder was, okay, I see that this guy is fertilizing himself and this guy's fertilizing himself, creating, identical copies of one another. But what would happen if I took the male gamete from one plant, a tall one, and I crossed it with the female gamete of the second one? So that's exactly what he did. He took a tall plant and he crossed it with a short plant. He took the pollen and he fertilized the female gamete on this plant, and obviously they're going to have children. So there's going to be some seeds produced. So what did these offspring, what did they look like? Well, 4 out of 4 plants, or 100% of the plants, bad flower, my bad. 4 out of 4 plants, 100% of the plants were tall. Didn't know why. Kind of curious, how come there weren't any that were kind of, maybe medium height? Or how come none of them were short? Because certainly some of this short plant's DNA was passed along to these offspring. He continued his studies, but he called, because we have generations, we have parents, we have, their children, and possibly their grandchildren. He called these generations, and specifically, he called these two parents the P generation, P for parent, and he called these offspring of the parents the F1 generation. He called it the F1 for first filial translating to son in Latin, which was his language. So we have the parents and their first generation of sons.